Industrialization. The Agricultural Revolution is what started the Industrialization Revolution. The Agricultural Revolution was a period in which farming was improvised. Due to the Agricultural Revolution, many people wanted to improve in their methods of farming by making it easier, to which led to many inventions and discoveries. During the 18th and 19th century, many discoveries and inventions were accumulating to the industry. The industry was rising with many inventions and discoveries. For example, steel, which started and helped the rise of the industry, oil, railroads, horseless carriages, airplanes, telegraphs, telephones, typewriters, and technology. The rise of the industry was known as the Second Industrialization Revolution. Due to the rise of the industry, many big businesses, factories, and corporations began to develop because of the industry rising. An invention that was developed in 1850s is steel by Henry Bessemer in Great Britain and William Cayley in the United States, which was then improved by Alexander Hawley. Due to the steel being available to many people in the 1800s, it resulted to a widespread in the industrial use. Steel was being used by many people to improve their inventions, for example, buildings, bridges, and railroads. With steel being developed, oil was being processed and developed as well in the 1850s. With the oil, it was refined as crude oil. With this, they developed kerosene, which could be used for light or the use of fuel. The Drake's Folly was developed in 1859. The Drake's Folly was a process in which Edwin L. Drake used a steam engine to drill oil near Tettsville, Pennsylvania. With the oil being produced, Elijah McCoy invented a lubricating cup that fed oil to parts of a machine while it was running. Oil became an important industrial use, which led railroads being developed. With oil and steel being developed, it led to railroads transportation because steel was cheap. Companies decided to lay thousands of miles of new tracks, but they weren't as long because of the Civil War, which made transportation somewhat hard because of the many trains people had to take. But within a decade, it developed better, which led to an easier transportation. With this, in 1869, the first transcontinental railroad was opened, which provided a 6-day service between the East Coast to San Francisco. The development of railroads allowed George Westinghouse to develop a compressed air brake, which made traveling easier and faster. He also developed a communication system that led trains and stations. With this also came many other transportations, like the horseless carriages and airplanes. During this time period also came the inventions of easier ways to communicate, such as telegraph. It sent information for businesses, governments, newspapers, and private citizens. This invention was developed by Samuel F. B. Morse. Another way to communicate was telephone, or talking telegraph, which was invented by Alexander Graham Bell. This development allowed Americans to stay in contact. Another was typewriters, which was invented by Christopher Sholes. Was another way for communication, mostly used in businesses. For example, many clerk workers' main task was to type. With the many inventions began to develop, a discovery of electricity, light bulbs, phonographs, and early motion cameras was founded by Thomas Alva Edison and his assistant Louis Latimer. Because so many inventions were developed, electricity made the development even easier. Because the industry was rising with many new inventions and discoveries, with this, many businesses and factories needed workers. Due to the demand of workers, many immigrants began to swell the cities. Poverty rose as immigrants began to come and work. The workers were known as the working class. Many of the working class people were immigrants and African Americans that were desperate for a job and the need of money. Because of the desperation of needing money, businesses decided to take advantage and pay them at a low rate. Having that so, the workers had little money and needed more enough to live somewhere better. So children started working, which started the child labor. as well as single women working for businessmen for a lower paying rate than men. Much of the working class were paid at a low wage and worked for long hours, including the children and women. With the low pay, many of the working class lived in poverty. They lived in places such as the Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan. In these areas, many gangs were involved, such as the 5 Points gangs. They lived in places where it was crowded and near the factories in which they worked. African Americans were discriminated and they had to pay more with the little money they received. They were paid less than others because they were African American. The workers worked in places where they were mistreated and had no respect. An example is a written book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. In this book, it contains information about the workers getting hurt in the meat factories because of the poor working conditions. The phenomenon during the 18th and 19th century of people and immigrants working and living in poverty was different than other urban lives that had occurred.
Throughout history, there have been 3 periods of mass migration to the Americas. This first period occurred when colonists fled to the U.S. to seek better lives. This lasted from about 1600 and peaked in the late 1700s during the beginning of the American Revolution. The 2 biggest waves of immigration to the Americas occurred between 1810 and 1920. The first wave of immigration lasted from 1820 to about 1870. During this time, 10.5 million immigrants came to the U.S. These immigrants, known as the old immigrants, because the immigrants of the later period were called the new immigrants. The old immigrants were mostly from Northern and Western Europe. The majority were Protestants. Germans and Irish each made up 1/3 of these immigrants. The Irish arrived in large numbers because of the variety of problems back in their homeland. The Napoleon Wars led to Ireland becoming overpopulated, and the Irish were left in poverty. The Irish also constantly faced religious criticism from Protestants, since most were Irish Catholics. However, the largest factor that pushed the Irish out was the potato famine. Around 1845, the potatoes in Ireland began to rot. Potatoes were the main food source for millions of Irish peasants. When they remained undependable for 5 years, it led to their starvation, and they were left with no choice but to flee to a new home. The Germans, however, were just leaving to seek more economic opportunities. There were many reasons why immigrants fled to the U.S. at this time. We know these as push-pull factors. Push factors were the reasons why they wanted to leave their countries. Pull factors were the reasons why they wanted to come to the U.S. Many push factors included religious and political persecution, loss of wealth, bad living conditions, natural disasters, etc. Many pull factors included religious and political freedom, job opportunities, better lives, and money, etc. The invention of the steamboat and steam train, better conditions on each of those, and the decline of travel costs made traveling convenient and easier. During the mid-1800s, news of gold in California attracted countless Chinese immigrants and sojourners which came to make enough money but then returned home. By 1870, 1/8 of the population was foreign. Some natives of the U.S. took the flood of immigrants at this time positively, others not so much. Some feared job competition and others disliked their religions and politics. These concerns led to the creation of groups like the Know Nothing Party, which was a group of people who wanted to place restrictions on immigration and nationalization. In 1875, the first immigration restriction law was passed. Convicts and prostitutes could not enter the country. The second largest wave of immigration spanned from around 1880 to about 1920. During this time, 23.5 million migrated to the U.S. These new immigrants consisted mostly of Southern and Eastern Europeans as opposed to the Northern and Western European-dominated old immigrants. Russians and Slovaks, Czechs, Hungarians, Italians, and Polish were included. Most of the time, they were either Catholic, Greek Orthodox, or Jewish. Many Arabs, Armenians, Chinese, French Canadians, and Japanese also arrived. Most Jews and Armenians fled to escape religious and political persecution, as opposed to the Italians and Slavics who were in search of economic opportunities. Millions of newcomers at this time arrived at the immigration stations Ellis Island in New York Harbor and Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. These new Newcomers were subject to physical exams and questioning. Those with serious health problems and criminal records were deported. The majority passed. Those arriving in Island were mostly Chinese, and most of them were Asians. These individuals faced harsh immigration laws which limited entrance to skilled individuals and those whose parents were native-born Americans. Those who didn't pass and weren't deported waited on rulings on their cases. Many immigrants found life better in the U.S. than their homeland. However, most were forced to live in crowded neighborhoods and slums and take low-paying, unskilled jobs and poor housing. In their new homeland, immigrants gathered and created immigrant communities that made life easier on them. Churches, synagogues, and temples also helped them maintain a sense of identity. Residents also formed unreligious and religious aid organizations called benevolent societies to help immigrants with sickness, unemployment, and death. In society, immigrants were encouraged to embrace the American life. Whether they did or not, most immigrants did America's dirty work. They found difficult work in construction, mines, and sweatshops. Hours were long and wages were low. Nativists blamed immigrants for these things. They thought their willingness to work cheaply robbed them of jobs and lowered everyone's wages. They were also blamed for crime and poverty, violence, and radical political ideas. They were seen as too different to assimilate. This created great animosity between nativists and immigrants. There were many examples of this. Around 1873, California's political leaders amended the Constitution to forbid Chinese residents of owning property. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which denied citizenship to people born in China and prohibited immigration of Chinese laborers. In 1894, wealthy Bostonians founded the Immigration Restriction League, which wanted to impose a literacy test on all immigrants. Contrary to what nativists thought, immigrants made positive contributions to the American economy. They helped populate the country. They helped make the U.S. the giant melting pot of ethnicities and culture that it is today. They made the rapid industrialization possible and strengthened the U.S. economy with their work in factories and added new dimensions to the life in the United States.